Great. Thank you very much for that introduction, and I'm delighted to be here this morning at such a beautiful venue. So as I said, my name is Claire. I'm one of the doctors that work in the memory clinics up in the north, and I'm also a researcher in Queen's. So I'm going to hopefully follow on from the talks that we've heard already this morning about how then the science that we know about dementia and memory disorders, how we can then design services for that, and my particular research interest on psychological stress and its effects on later life memory. Okay, so as we heard, dementia itself is an umbrella term, and lots of different conditions kind of can cause that. Alzheimer's is the one that you would hear most about, and it's the most common cause. But it's, as we've heard from Professor Kennelly's talk there, it's a really exciting time to be in this field because there are huge amounts of change. And I think one of the most positive changes is that we've seen is certainly a breakdown in stigma that surrounds these conditions, and the increase in awareness. Purely even by your attendance here today just shows how far we've come with that we're engaging members of the public and members of our research colleagues to talk more about this and to learn from each other about how we can improve how we serve people living with these conditions. But that isn't without its challenges, and we've seen this curve already today. So one of the problems with dementia diagnosis and these conditions is that there can be a very long preclinical phase. And so the protein changes and changes in the brain that then present as memory problems can begin, 20, 30 years beforehand. So there's opportunity there to intervene earlier. What we're finding now, as well as research is improving, is has been a lot of misdiagnosis, and there's far more often the case that there's usually mixed pathology. So people may have evidence of Alzheimer's disease, but also then could have vascular disease or have had strokes or mini strokes in the past as well. And that can make their presentation on this clinical journey a lot earlier, and they can present, traditionally with a very slow kind of onset of their memory symptoms, but then sudden changes as well. There's also challenges too in terms of equitable access to kind of clinical investigations and treatments. We heard about some of the biomarker work, for example. That's not available at every memory clinic across Ireland, and neither is access to all the imaging centres that we would ideally like to use. So depending where people are presenting, they may have a different course to the point of their diagnosis. And also, we're not seeing as much people with these memory problems as we would expect. So for the latest results for the years 22-23 in Northern Ireland, we're only diagnosing about 62% of all those aged over 65 that are expected to be living with dementia. And part of that is a kind of a post-COVID recovery, and part also is as people not seeking help or identifying concerns. So there are people living in our community who may potentially benefit from diagnosis, assessment, and then the MDT input. But as we're saying, everything is about moving towards the timeline, and as a psychiatrist, I've trained to kind of look at people as the whole picture, and I've tried to take a life course approach to risk. So when we talk about risk factors and the likes of psychological stress as a risk factor, it's very rarely just one point in time. So it's often the case with these conditions, like many other later life health conditions, it's usually the accumulation of lots of different small events over the course of our time. And as the likes of myself who study kind of research over the life course and different exposures, we find more and more that there's potentially critical periods where if somebody experiences those risks at that time, that they would be more likely to experience the outcome of interest. But that then offers opportunity, that's the time that we need to intervene. So how do we design services to target these at-risk groups? So we're spending lots of this research money to try and improve how we identify people, but how then can we deliver a service? So it's naturally going to be a tiered approach. So we think, first of all, as a public health model. So that was just getting awareness out there and public health interventions. So the amount of new cases of dementia worldwide is dropping, and part of the reason for that is the result of public health interventions. So mandatory education and public health changes such as smoking cessation has actually resulted in less new cases of dementia. But we offset that our population is aging, so that's why we're seeing more and more people living with dementia. Then we move to our targeted populations. So these would be people that we would have known to have higher risk. And then we think more of then a clinical kind of secondary care service. So those who are at higher risk that would benefit from being known to a memory clinic or a brain health service. And that's where we would be assessing their risk and looking for early disease detection and then kind of personalised prevention plans. So there's scalability here in terms of interventions. And when people come to see us in the memory clinic, as well as looking at the clinical history and some of the biomarkers investigations, we also spend the time addressing potential modifiable risk factors. And these, again, occur over the life course. So these are the 14 kind of most well-studied risk factors for dementia in later life. And what's presented here is the what they call population attributable risk. So they studied huge amounts of studies, and they pulled the resources together to look at these different risk factors for later life dementia. And what they found is that if we could address and remove all of these risk factors, potentially 45% of dementia cases wouldn't exist. And that's the risk factors as well. But even if you're in clinic and presenting with memory problems, we will still work with you to address these risk factors, because we know everything is about living well with dementia, and it's not just about risk prevention. So even if you have a diagnosis of dementia, if you remain physically active, if you do not smoke, if you maintain your weight, if you're socially connected, you will live better and you will live longer than if you don't. There's some really interesting new ones here that have been added. So particularly thinking about our sensory issues. So if you have any degree of hearing impairment, or then most recently visual impairment has been added, they are not only just affect kind of your ability to engage in your community, but they do cause then changes in the brain that can increase the risk of dementia. And then the kind of effects of air pollution as well, which is getting a lot of kind of research attention. But when we think about all these risk factors together, what really we're trying to look at about people then building cognitive and brain reserve. So that's where, you know, education and continued education over the life course, it can be really helpful. Risk factors then that could that affect how the neuropathology, so the abnormal proteins that Professor Pinelli was mentioning, and some of these risk factors directly impact them. Decreasing the vascular damage, so your risk of heart disease or stroke, and then stress and inflammation. So often it's cases that dementia and Alzheimer's are seen as kind of a pro-inflammatory state. So the body is kind of primed to be in kind of a state of stress, and it can cause these biological changes that then can manifest with dementia. This is this diagram in a slightly different way, but you can see that disproportionately the research has been done in older adults. And this is a kind of an infographic of just well-known risk and protective factors. So within my own research, I've been looking at the effects of psychological stress. And again, thinking of this life course model, how then that can affect earlier life stress experiences, how that can then affect later life memory outcomes. And I think everyone in the room can appreciate that stress can be difficult, but it also can be very individual. We will all have experienced stress at some time in our life, but we all respond to stress at different times. And I think Helen's introduction was a really eloquent example of that. And she talked about her diagnosis and how she initially retreated, but then actually then with time, she was really informed and then was really proactive and with her condition. And so you can see here that even individuals' response to stress is not, a singular event. People can respond to stress at different time points as well. But traditionally, the research on this area was very linear. It was assumed that all stress was bad and that the more stress you experience, the worse the health outcomes it would have. And to an extent, that's right. Whenever we experience stress, our body enters the fight or flight mode, and that causes lots of changes within the biology of our body, and can cause even permanent changes. Our bodies are amazing things, and we always try and adapt back to baseline. But if we have repeated stressors in our life, if constant negative experiences, and we don't have the resilience or support to kind of get back to that baseline, it can cause those more permanent changes to bed in. But we need to update our hypothesis on how we view stress in terms of aging outcomes. And one of this is kind of take into account that individual level experience. So how much reserve capacity or resilience or social support does an individual have, and how that affects then their response when acute stressors happen in their life. One of the thoughts is that if we experience multiple stresses in our life, it can actually make us biologically age quicker. And that's where I'm saying the body has lost the ability to adapt as well to the aging process. And so one of the theories that I was working with during my PhD was whether or not it was that was leading to the later life memory problems. So whether or not your stressful experience will cause you to age quicker, and then that raised your likelihood of age-associated conditions like memory problems. And as a social scientist, I'm really interested actually how our environment affects us. So we all know the messages about living well, eating well, but how does that actually embed biologically? And one of the tools that I've used through my research is DNA methylation or epigenetics. So we see here in the blue image, that's that's chromosome. So this is kind of our codes of our DNA. And our DNA is constant. It's the exact same in every cell of the body, but there are different changes. So you can see here in this image, these are two identical twins. So they share the exact same genetic code. So if we were to take their DNA, it would be the exact same. However, you can appreciate they have very different physical appearances. And this is on the basis that the twin on your right was a smoker and didn't wear sun cream. And so this is a really great example of how our environmental exposures can actually affect our aging process. So how can we measure that? So one of the tools we have is DNA methylation, where we look at the yellow tags that are on parts of our DNA code, and we look at whether or not those are on or off, or methylated or unmethylated. The analogy I like to use is our genetic code is like the recipe, and our epigenetics is how we follow that recipe. So how we set, what temperature we set the oven, how long we mix the ingredients for, and we can end up with a different result. So we've used that within the NICOLA study. So the NICOLA is the Northern Ireland cohort for the longitudinal study of aging. So it's a nationally representative study of aging in the north. And it's a sister study of the TILDA study, if anybody's familiar with that down south here. So we've recognised that we need to develop research at a population level if we're going to then be recommending population level interventions. And so that's why these studies are fantastic resources. So I looked at wave 1 of NICOLA, which was in the field from 2013 to 2016, and 8,500 participants in the north were recruited, aged over 50, and they undertook different waves of assessment. So we looked at lots of different aspects of their life and their health, and then underwent some memory tests as well. And what we found was that better memory performance in NICOLA was associated with being younger, being male, being better educated, having lower depression, and having higher levels of social engagement. So that all fits. That's like what we would expect and what we've known from the research. However, something really unique came out in that those who reported higher exposure to troubles-related events, so that's the Northern Ireland troubles, the 30-year civilian conflict, higher troubles exposures, they performed better. So this is really curious to us when we followed it. So we wanted to look at, first of all, the reporting of the Northern Ireland troubles. So if by design, NICOLA is not a troubles-related cohort, it's a nationally representative cohort, and yet nearly half of all our participants reported that the troubles had a moderate to extreme impact on their life. And that fits with the demographics of this group. So individuals were asked as well about different troubles experiences, right, from army searches to having a family member murdered. And you can see how many endorsed that. So, nearly 15% kind of endorsed over 15 items of troubles related events. But what's really curious to me, and what I've kind of explored more in my research and wouldn't have time to present as much today, is those who had high numbers of troubles events. So they, had to move house because of intimidation. They were personally assaulted or knew somebody that was murdered, but didn't subjectively report that anything traumatic happened in their life. So have they this inbuilt resilience, or is this, how have they processed that traumatic experience, and how does the difference between what we test and what we objectively measure and what we ask people to subjectively report, how does that affect the health outcomes that we're interested in? So when we look then just at not just the troubles, just any self-reported traumatic event, again, significant proportions said that something traumatic had happened to them. And this is them in their own words. It's a very open-ended question. So 43% of all response. And when we looked at actually the details of that, this reflects what we know about stress and trauma, in that the sudden death of a spouse or family member is seen as one of the most significant traumatic events that can happen. And then we have some of the unique things coming through about the troubles, but then personal illness or illness of a family member or friend. So when we then went to look at that in terms of then the memory performance, thinking our analogy would be that the trauma would cause worse memory in later life. It wasn't the case. So the MMSE and MOCA here in the tables are our global tests for memory. And we could see here that even in all the models, essentially what we're showing is the positive scores. So the fact that it's 0.49 and not a negative number means that those who experienced trauma were performing better in these memory tests than those that didn't. And this was the same direction of effect for those who said the troubles had a big impact too. When we think then of our most stressed individuals, so those who experienced trauma in their life then that are currently experiencing PTSD, it was the opposite. So it's definitely something about the timing and severity of these symptoms that are driving the memory problems later in life. And then when we looked at then in terms of the biological aging, we did find what we expected, in that those who had PTSD or severe trauma were biologically older than those who hadn't. So on one hand, we fit the hypothesis that trauma is aging us biologically, but then we're showing that that isn't matching then the memory performance in later life. So I think what it ultimately says is that we still need to maintain and build this model and understand that people's experiences are at an individual level. We need to look at their surrounding social environment to not just understand how they experience stress, but how they cope with it. And then for many people, having a stressful experience can actually develop very positive health behaviours that can then reduce risk. So, and then about this critical periods. So is it when the stress occurs that has the most impact on later life outcome? And then how useful would these type of biomarkers be in the clinic? So putting that all together, some of the steps that we can do to improve our brain health, and these are really well researched models, but take regular exercise, eat a well-balanced diet, particularly most evidence for Mediterranean style and low in saturated fats. Stay connected, and that could be through social connections or even events like this as well. So learning new things, meeting new people, keeping that stimulation alive. Address any risk factors that we've talked about today. So trying to not smoke and reduce alcohol intake. Switch off. So if you are experiencing stress in your life, find positive ways to cope with that. Address and look after any mental health difficulties that you have and seek support for that. And then get plenty of sleep as well. And then be aware of existing medical conditions, so things like heart disease and diabetes. So just like to acknowledge my group, and I welcome any questions in this session after.